Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Scott Shay. He's the author of 3 books, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award, Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize American Jewry, as well as his latest book, Conspiracy U, a Case Study. He is also the founder and chairman of Signature Bank. Enjoy my conversation with Scott Shay. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I am really looking forward to this conversation because I actually heard about you through a recent article that you wrote in eJewish Philanthropy, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But why don't you start by telling us who you are, where you're from, everything that led to where you are today. I have to say that you're sort of an outsider like me in the Jewish world, and I think a lot of people listening to this probably haven't heard your name compared to maybe some of the other names inside the Jewish world. So really give us a good background up until where you are today.
So there's something that you need to know is that I'm a son of a Holocaust survivor. I'm the only child of a Holocaust survivor. My father's family was essentially wiped out in Sveksna, Lithuania. He more or less saw his father murdered in front of him. His brothers were murdered, his aunts, his uncles, all of his cousins were murdered. My closest relative is a second cousin once removed, who happened to be her mother happened to be outside, had already gone to Palestine, planning to come back, but never made it back, thank God. And I grew up in Chicago, lower middle class neighborhood in East Rogers Park. Went to Northwestern, went to business school at Northwestern. Then I came to New York and joined Salomon Brothers in the halcyon days of Salomon Brothers. Then went to co-found a private equity firm with Lou Ranieri, who was my mentor, who I'm one of my best friends of my entire life, and tremendously brilliant person. And then about 22, 23 years ago, I had this crazy idea to start a bank in New York because I thought New York was over-branched, but under really professionally banked. And so with 2 co-founders who I convinced that this wasn't such a crazy idea, Joe DiPaolo and Jen Tamberland, we opened our doors with no deposits, nothing. No clients. By the way, we were losing $3 million a month. And importantly, Bank Hapoalim put in the initial seed capital. So they were an early believer. They subsequently sold out, but fast forward 21 months later, we broke even. 34 months later, we went public. And today we're a bank of well over $100 billion in assets. And we've never done an acquisition. So everybody who's come into the bank has wanted to be here. We haven't sort of gotten any legacy clients. So that's what I do in the business world. And in the Jewish world, I take it very seriously as a lay person, as a lay leader. And to a certain degree, you're correct. I'm an outsider, but not completely an outsider, I have to say.
Why do you say that? Tell us more about that.
Well, I am involved in the organized Jewish community. I was on the executive committee of UJ Federation of New York. I was on the Birthright Israel Steering Committee. I was chair of the Association of Teen Travel Groups to Israel. So those would all have to be considered as part of the Jewish community. I'm president of Chai Mitzvah. So I can't say I'm totally outside of the Jewish community. That wouldn't be correct. But I am not sort of part of that central group that thinks on behalf of the Jewish community. That's for sure.
So I guess now that I have a little bit more background, I guess what I would say is maybe outsider, insider isn't the right term, but more you're not afraid to call out what's wrong. And I feel that a lot of people that are truly in the industry, first of all, a lot of them aren't so in it that they can't even see what's wrong.
Right.
Or they're so in that echo chamber. or they know what's wrong, which I find a lot of people to be in that area, but they just don't have, for whatever reason, the chutzpah, if you will,
Correct.
to call out, these things, and obviously call it in a professional way, not trying to attack any individuals or trying to, there has been a lot of great work done in the Jewish world. I'm not saying everything's wrong, but at the same time, we know that we're facing a lot of issues. And one of the issues that we're facing is a brilliant article that you wrote, as I mentioned, in the E-Jewish Philanthropy website, which in short talks about how Jewish and Israel study departments not only fail in their duty to teach students the full array of scholarship on Israel, but they've become, as you say in your words, indistinguishable in their politics from the highly politicized Arab nationalist Middle Eastern studies departments. Now,
Yes.
first of all, it's not only a mouthful, but that's a damning statement. And I just want you to give us some context, because I know you have a book that revolved around this as well. You have 3 books in total, but one of them revolves around this issue. Before we go into the books and that book specifically, just tell us why you wrote this and where it came from.
So in terms of the article, we'll stick with the article for the moment, then we can talk about the book. So look, a lot of people give to Jewish departments, Jewish studies departments at universities, the best fundraisers on this planet, and probably in this sector of the galaxy, are universities. And they've convinced boatloads of Jews to give generously to Jewish studies and Israel studies departments. At the same time, by the way, Qatar and other Middle Eastern countries that are certainly not pro-Israel, that's for sure, have given $6 billion to Middle Eastern studies groups, plus Middle Eastern studies departments are generally funded by universities. Jewish studies departments largely have been funded by Jews who think that Jewish education, not Jewish education, that educating people about Jews will reduce anti-Semitism, will reduce Jewish hatred. And boy, are they wrong, unfortunately, because the zeitgeist in the university is distinctly anti-Jewish, to be perfectly honest, not just anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish, because Jews somehow are the only group whose indigeneity, their right to be called an indigenous people, somehow is an expiration date. And Jews are the only ones that you can write conspiracy theories about, have them peer reviewed and published by Duke University Press or Stanford University Press. I'll give you a couple of examples. Jasper Puar wrote a book that says that the Jews are organ harvesting in Israel from the Palestinians. It alleges that Jews are using high-tech biotechnologies to hack the DNA of occupied Palestinians in order to systemically starve them, that the IDF tries not to kill people, but she's very bothered by the fact that, compared to any other conflict in the world, there are so few Palestinian casualties. So she comes up with this theory that IDF has a policy of maiming. So all of this, organ harvesting, DNA hacking, there's actually no evidence of any of it other than things that she imagines in her mind. She's become a full professor at Rutgers. She's a rock star on campuses around the country. Published a book that passed peer review. And it's chock full of conspiracy theories. A professor at the time at Illinois, Stephen Saleta, wrote a book that says that Jews, I quote this in Conspiracy U, the Jews essentially caused, he uses mealy-mouthed words, but essentially caused the Holocaust. That somehow the Holocaust was a precursor to dispossessing Palestinians of their land. Now, again, you couldn't imagine such a thing, except again, published by Duke University Press. Stanford University Press published a book by a professor at Northwestern, my alma mater, and a co-author, in which you can't actually understand the book unless you first totally drink the Kool-Aid that Zionists are evil. She uses campus rabbis in quotation marks because they're not really campus rabbis. They're really somehow Zionist infiltrators. And then writes a whole book alleging that Zionists are conspiring against anthropology departments across the country. And she brings 3 cases of 2 people who are professors who were up for tenure, who wrote virulently anti-Israel stuff, whose scholarship wasn't that good, but then argues that the only reason that there was any question about their tenure was because they were they were anti-Israel. And then, of course, they both received tenure. And then also has a case with an administrator who withdrew her name. In any event, she writes a book, finds no evidence anywhere, and then concludes that, of course, this is even more certainty that it's true because the Zionists are so good at covering their tracks. It doesn't actually, even when talking about these 2 anti-Israel professors, doesn't look at their scholarship, doesn't look at how many other professors of anthropology had their tenure reviewed or at least questioned before they were given tenure, just assumes that if you're anti-Israel, that somehow that means that these evil Zionists have a conspiracy against you. Now, here's the thing, and then I'll conclude with this. Jewish studies groups have totally inculcated themselves in this. In May of 2014, they wrote the same 200 of them or so from Jewish studies groups wrote the same banal drivel that, about Jews systemically oppressing colonialists, apartheid, all the sort of stuff that, like appears over and over and over again. And again, questions Jewish indigeneity. So these are people who are reading ancient Jewish texts, but think that Jews arrived in Israel after 1897. Actually, they're willfully stupid. And you have people, or they're making themselves willfully stupid, which is a total betrayal of scholarship. Yeah. And you have a professor, and what one of the things that I mentioned in the article is you have a department at University of Washington where the head of the department was appointed and doesn't even like the word Israel. Doesn't even like the word Israel. You have other professors. A professor from Pennsylvania wrote who wrote a book about Jewish philanthropy and focuses on a few men, sort of almost at random. And writes an anti-Jewish screed. You can't actually imagine. Now, by the way, every other ethnic studies group applauds, lauds, celebrates the people they study, except for the Jews, where the professors feel that they have to denigrate them. Sorry for going on so long.
No, that's totally fine. And you gave some really important examples. And you and I can see each other on video. People that are listening will only have the audio. But I'm just laughing at the stupidity and the ridiculousness of these examples because it's just absurd. But I do want to play devil's advocate for a second, because we talked about insider, outsider in the Jewish world. And I would make the argument, based on my own research, talking to literally hundreds of people like yourself, rabbis, lay leaders, heads of organizations, family foundations, etc., that we have about 15 core macro problems in the Jewish world, meaning these are essentially global. I try not to focus on local stuff because, local changes from place to place, and you have Israel and you have the diaspora, but we have 15. Okay.
So in getting our group back, I said 10, but okay, I won't quibble.
So 14 of the 15 are self-imposed, self-created, I should say. And the 15th is basically what you're talking about, which is anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, etc. So what I would say as a counter argument to yours is not that it deletes or neutralizes what you're talking about, which is very valid, but I would say that the Jewish people are not helping their own cause because the organizations that are tasked with carrying the Jewish mantle, if you will, whether it be the Birthright to the World, you mentioned that, whether it be Hillel, whether it be Jewish National Fund, whether it be the Jewish Agency for Israel, et cetera, have completely failed in counteracting all the nonsense that you've been talking about. To that.
So By the way, you went on mute if that's what you want. So first of all, a lot of our problems are self-imposed and and caused by a lack of leadership and a lack of vision and a lack of due diligence. I mean, people give to, so I did some studying of who's giving to Jewish studies groups, Jewish studies departments and Israel studies departments, and they're sort of the usual suspects, as it were, in terms of foundations and folks who want to be helpful and are well-meaning, but they're bamboozled by the universities, who on the one hand say that donors can't have any impact on their on what is taught or how it's taught. On the other hand, take $6 billion of Qatar. My alma mater took $500 million from Qatar. And so Qatar is supporting exactly what they want, whereas Jews are expected to support whatever the universities tell them they should want. That's self-imposed. That doesn't need to be. I do think there have been initiatives like Birthright, which have been extraordinarily helpful. I think that the fact that people won't post that they're on Birthright anymore, that they're afraid to do it if they're on campus. It used to be 15 years ago, people would go on Birthright trips and their Facebook pages and I don't know if Instagram was around at that time, but whatever social media they were using was full of what was going on in their trip. Now we've got a situation where people are sort of whispering on campus. And then one of your previous guests, Yossi Klein-Alevi, who actually went to we overlapped at Northwestern, he talks about the return of the Jewish whisper. And that's happening. So, and the return of the Jewish whisper is from outside imposed anti-Semitism, Jewish hatred, anti-Israelism.
Yeah, but isn't it also a lack of Jewish pride? Like, there's two sides to that coin, in my opinion. There's the anti-Semitism aspect, and then there's the lack of Jewish pride. That if we do not, most Jews today feel very unengaged with their Judaism, yep, or don't know how to express their Jewish pride because they don't have the education. It is education. I'm trying to understand. I mean, listen, Jewish studies is important. Israel studies is important, but the vast majority of people in the world, including Jews, will never get formal higher education, Jewish and Israel studies. And they will follow Birthright on Instagram, or they will follow Hillel, or they will come into contact with other organizations. And my thing is this: those organizations have not done a good enough job of doing formal and informal education, despite having billions with a B, not millions, billions with a B of dollars every year to play with, and nothing to show for it, as far as I'm concerned.
So here's the thing. I don't want to go so far as to say nothing for show for it. I will push back. I do think Hillels have been afraid to engage on being pro-Israel because they want to be this, sort of tent to all people. And I think that's honestly a mistake, because I do think one should be proudly Jewish. I don't see any reason not to be. We're at 3,000, we're about to celebrate Shavuot. I don't know when this is going to be aired, but 3,335 years ago or so, we are around. But even forget about what it says in the Bible. 3,000 years ago, there's archaeological evidence. We're an old people. We predate the concepts of race, the concepts of even religion. So we don't fit into any boxes, but we've been around for a long time. There's really should be no dispute about that, except people who make themselves willfully stupid and are willfully ignorant. So I do think we have a lot to be proud of. We've done a lot of stuff in the world. I don't need to, recite it. And yet the thing that is being taught on the outside, and the reason why it's so insidious, is the exact opposite is being taught, which is be quiet, shas still, as they used to say in Yiddish. Be quiet. Don't be proud of being a Jew. Cover up. whisper. And unfortunately, that is becoming digested. Now, in the old days, and they weren't such good days, when Jews were in the ghetto or in the shtetl, if you had to be embarrassed, if you had to be quiet, well, you still weren't going to be able to be assimilated in the outside community. You still were going to remain Jewish. Now, it's very easy to become not Jewish in a generation, in a lifetime, to move somewhere. My name is Shay. Most people don't even take that as a Jewish name. When I moved from Chicago to New York, I could have just blended in if I didn't have any Jewish pride. It would have been so easy. And it is so easy for most people. That's why the intermarriage rate among non-Orthodox is approaching 60%. It is 60%. And it's a serious problem in terms of folks who marry, whose spouses don't convert, and what happens through the next generation. I showed in getting our group back that the statistics are that less than 10% of the grandchildren, far less than 10% of grandchildren of intermarried couples will not identify even as Jewish. The exception to that, there are exceptions to that, and we should encourage them and celebrate them and we need to be more welcoming as a Jewish people too. But even there, when you look at the statistics, Jews are pretty welcoming. The statistics are that folks from the outside actually do generally feel welcomed. Now, always more can be done and should be done, but we're definitely not playing up the Jewish pride part enough. You're 100% correct.
And I do want to go back and sort of rephrase what I said. It's not that we have nothing to show for it, but I would say relative to the amount of money that we spend on our philanthropy by and large, it's disproportionate. I mean, the results are nowhere near. And in fact, in 1897, Theodor Herzl, the great Zionist himself, said exactly that. In 1897, Scott, this is over 100 years ago, he said, the great amount of philanthropy that we spend money on pales in comparison, or I should say the results pale in comparison to the amount of money we're spending. And I would say over 100 years later, the same is to be said. We're spending more money in the Jewish world in various ways. Some of it, by the way, is great, like things, hospitals and certain types of education and old age homes. We're also spending a lot of money on bringing people to Israel and other things that we can argue if they're effective. So I do want to say little has been shown compared to the amount of money we spend. I do want to go to your book because you mentioned Hillel, and there's a lot of talk today about the issue with anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and just in general, a lot of conspiracies being celebrated and uplifted on campuses. And you wrote a really phenomenal book, Conspiracy You, your third of 3 books that you've written. Tell us about the book. I mean, it's a loaded title, and I know in there you did a lot of research, as you talked about. But what did you try to accomplish with this third book?
Well, what I tried to accomplish was I started the book basically to commemorate. It was started as a 2,500 word article to commemorate the 75th anniversary of my late father's liberation from Dachau. And I started by going back to a professor at Northwestern who is a tenured professor of electrical engineering, Arthur Butts, who wrote a book called The Hoax of the 20th Century. And in it, he basically alleges that there was not much to the Holocaust. Maybe a few people died of typhoid. It was all a myth. And a myth that was interesting in that I didn't realize it, but he claims it was a myth propagated by Zionists. So I started to read his book, and I realized as I was reading it, I was diving into a conspiracy theory. There were tens of thousands of documents found in Europe, in post-World War II Europe, that really extraordinarily document and show the execution of the murder of 6 million-ish Jews. So what does he do? He has a conspiracy theory that Zionists forged many, many more documents, planted them all around Europe, and some in different languages, all to be accidentally discovered. What a great conspiracy. How evil these group of conspirators are. What about all the people who testified to being perpetrators, who confessed to being perpetrators, who confessed to being witnesses, who confessed to, or didn't confess, but just talked about witnessing, being bystanders? Well, they were all bamboozled by Zionists. Even poor, innocent, honest, heartwarming, and caring Nazis who would never think of harming anybody were bamboozled by these evil Zionists, he argues. It's just a shame how these Zionists are so evil. Anyway, you get my point. Anytime there's a fact, he essentially expands the theory non-falsifiably around it. And I discovered that the same thing the far left it does is the far left. I mean, Jasper Puar has no evidence. I mean, it's actually laughable that someone got tenure with her documentation. It should have gotten, and her writing is incredible. It's indecipherable. But yet, anytime there's a fact, she makes up something around it. Well, since 1953, Israel stopped prosecuting homosexuality. Well, that must be because they were trying to show favor among and get academics to join them and to get LGBTQ people to join them. And so there was some nefarious reason. Now, in 1953, not a lot of people were thinking that way, but that doesn't matter because you've got to understand we're talking about Jews. Constantly, I mentioned Stephen Saleta before. He bases his theories on literally nothing except words like it seems or it must be. Unbelievable that that's going to happen. And when I boil down the theories, they actually totally agree on everything about Jews, nothing about anything else, but everything about Jews. Some of the words are the same. And I show how these go back, and I show how essentially, if you read the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which talks about Israel being a colonialist, they made it up. And we now have from the Soviet archives, because of the fall of the Soviet Union, we now know that the people writing the Great Soviet Encyclopedia knew they were making it up. And yet people are writing not approximately, but almost the same thing that was in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. And Mein Kampf, you can find that happening today. You have this Gaza Ferguson theory, where the only things together, I read the book, and literally there are no facts. Yet this is an assigned book. I talked to one person who was assigned this book twice in one semester. Obviously, Orientalism is assigned almost in every class at Columbia by Edward Said. So, and when you read them, they're conspiracy theories. They're not the traditional, they don't have the traditional uses of evidence that other disciplines have. And I just want to say one more thing. The Jews are the canary in the coal mine here of non-factual, non-evidence-based, I don't want to call it scholarship, advocacy that's cloaked under, that's housed at universities. We're the canary in the coal mine. It's not good for the canary because the canary dies first, but it's also not good for the coal miners.
No, I couldn't agree more with that. That's a beautiful metaphor. I want to talk also about your first two books. You mentioned the second one, Getting Our Groove Back.
First one was Getting Our Groove Back. That was the one I wrote years ago in the Jewish community in 2007.
Yeah, so we have Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize the American Jewry, and then we also have In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, which was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award. Mazal Tov, Agav, by the way. So Tell me about first. Let's talk about the American Jewry, because we know second biggest Jewish population in the world. You write the book. What did you learn about American Jewry, and ultimately, what are some of the things that you wrote the book a few years ago, but what are some of the things that are still very true today?
So I wrote Getting Our Groove Back because like you, Josh, I really was seeing a lot of money be spent and not enough return. Really the risk return was not there. And so I wanted to say, here were 10 things. I didn't say 15. So, we're very fond, again, we're coming to Shavuot of 10 as a number. So I wrote 10 issues. Like you, 9 of them were internal. Only one was external, and that again was anti-Semitism, Jewish hatred, anti-Israelism. So sadly, I think now the reason I say it was back in 2007 is I can tell what's played out. How Hebrew schools failed, how parents somehow think they can subcontract their parents' Jewish identity to Hebrew school. Ridiculous idea, and not be involved in creating a proud Jewish identity. I talked about financing day schools. I talked about trips to Israel and what they need to be. And I focused on high school programs, by the way, longer term, not that long term, but 3-4 week programs that would actually happen when identity formation is taking place. So, as we talked about, I think in the beginning, and I chaired for a while the Association of Teen Travel Tours to Israel, because that's, I think, where we could spend money most effectively. And I am glad that Sof Hadavar, the Marcus Foundation, is heavily subsidizing those groups, which is something, chadash tachat hashamayim, it's new under the sun. So, but a lot of things that I wrote about, people just didn't do. Jewish literacy, people literally know nothing that I talked to, remarkably so. Can't really explain what Hanukkah is about. Some that do think it had to do with the Romans, not the Greeks. Just don't know enough Jewish history to actually respond to the indigeneity question. They don't even know where they're from. They don't know that Jews were a majority of the land of Israel, certainly until the 4th century of this 4th century, probably until the 7th century. And it was only once there was there was an invasion from Arabia that Arabs came to what was until then the land of Israel. Yes, it was renamed Delia Capitolona. Jerusalem was renamed. Palestine was renamed by the Romans, but it was the same place. People don't know that. They don't know when people on campus say that Jews are white. Well, more than half of Jews were Mizrahi. They're from the Middle East. They never actually even left the Middle East. So there's so many falsehoods. And that's one of the things the Jewish literacy, and that's what I've been trying on a sort of a personal level to combat. And that's what Chai Mitzvah is all about. It's a set of studies to give people just a super high level understanding of what it means to be part of the Jewish people, and have like the basics of Jewish religion. And so that's why I feel so passionately about it. It's super duper important. And I go through, I don't want to do all 10, but I go through the various steps, most of which the Jewish community has left there. Now, I do think there have been pockets of effectiveness. So I don't want to paint everything with the same broad brush. But sadly, it's a serious problem, not resolved. And can I say one thing? Just one last thing. My book, The Getting Our Groove Back, sold 17,000 copies. 99.5% of them were within the Jewish community. And people were talking about it, but it's very hard to rouse yourself if you're in any organization, Jewish or not.
So a few things that you said that I want to pick apart with you. You mentioned the term heavily subsidized. And I have a theory. I, like you, am a business person. And I believe the best businesses provide experiences. And great experiences not only have those people coming back for more of them, but tell their family and friends to do the same. And in the Jewish world, we, as you said, heavily subsidize a lot of experiences. And when you heavily subsidize an experience, you therefore provide a experience that is not very good, because the people that are tasked with executing that experience, making the experience come to life, first of all, many of them are not skilled in experience making. Let's start there. And two, they have this mentality that it's like this community, and it's like, you look at experiences, whether it's conferences, whether it's trips, travel, etc. First of all, a lot of that's done in the for-profit sector, the private sector, not in the nonprofit. And second of all, they're done at the highest possible levels to produce the best results and provide the best experiences to the people that show up at these things, virtually, digitally, or in real life. In the Jewish world, we don't see that, Scott. And that's an issue here, because we're talking about Jewish literacy, and we're talking about a lack of Jewish pride in many cases and among many people. But we as the Jewish world are not providing the level of experiences that get people to be more Jewishly literate, that get people to be more proud of their Judaism, that get non-Jews to be our allies, our non-Jewish family, friends, and communities, to say, I also want to learn about this thing you have called Shabbat, or I also want to learn about this beautiful country you built called Israel. And when we heavily subsidize experiences for, by the way, an audience that doesn't really need that subsidy, let's be honest about that, I believe that results in a heavily subsidized Jewish experience, which therefore creates very little results that speak to the kind of things that you and I care about. What do you say to all that?
Well, first of all, I'd say, again, don't paint with too broad a brush. I think Jewish teen travel to Israel is expensive. I mean, just the ticket on El Al is expensive. So if you pay for the ticket to El Al and make it equivalent to camp in the United States or other things, I think you're going to go a long way. So I'm not saying, and I never advocated, by the way, for teen travel to Israel to be free. I don't think it should be free except on a needs basis. But I do think that it is, living a full Jewish life in the United States is somewhat expensive. I mean, camp is expensive. You know, even synagogue these days, we pay an anti-Semitism tax for security, which is, astounding. Day school, all of this stuff, even Hebrew school costs more than $2,000 a year. So I'm not against subsidies. I think they're good, but I agree with you that giving stuff away for free has its question marks. I mean, that was the big question. That was the big debate for Birthright, was making the trip free or not. And do you debase the trip by making it free? That's a long conversation. And by the way, we need to restart the podcast to do that, because it would take the full hour. And I can actually debate both sides, which is an important part, which people on campus can no longer do. They just, one side's right and the other side is to be denigrated, parenthetically. But I do agree with you that we are about creating experiences. And I do think, look, one of the best teen travel providers is actually a for-profit group. And they do a great job. So look, I'm all for sustainability, and I think profit is how you sustain stuff. But not everybody in the United States is rich who's Jewish, and I think that's actually something that people might think, but it's not really. I really don't think that's true. I think making it affordable is important. Making it free, less so.
Definitely, and I want to be clear that wasn't trying to imply that all Jews are rich or even well off. I know a lot of Jews
Right.
are either lower class or lower middle class or what have you,
Or
including
struggling
in
for
Israel.
one reason. Yeah.
So, but I want to ask you one more question before we wrap up here
Yep.
about sort of this nonprofit for-profit dichotomy, if you will. You know, it's funny because, you know, you talk about, you know, making things affordable. And I would say that the for-profit world, your world, my world, we know how to drive down costs because in a for-profit world, you have to be highly efficient and you have to, in today's technology world, achieve scale, which therefore drives down costs as well. And so, you know, one of the things that I personally have had a hard time doing, starting my first Jewish quote unquote startup, Izzy, and now working on Jewel, is getting people like yourself, not you specifically, because I've never met you, but getting people like yourself who I believe come from relatively well-to-do means, getting you to invest in Jewish progress, literacy, education, experiences, not donate. Now, that takes there's a lot there, obviously. We only have a few minutes left, but I do find that there's still a lot of pushback that you know, people that sit in your shoes or your seat, I should say, you know, are very aware of the problems that we've talked about and are concerned by them, and yet still put tons of money, as we talked about, into things that clearly are just not working at the level that they could potentially work in the for-profit world. And so I'm just curious, as I sort of paint this picture for you, again, this is not personal because I don't know you. But when I say that, you know, maybe we should start balancing sort of the nonprofit for-profit world and not basically a 99 to 1% ratio, which it is today, in fact, I'm just curious what goes through your mind as I start to paint this picture.
Well, I don't think there's any problem with having for-profit Jewish endeavors whatsoever. I think it's about a business plan. Actually, there are plenty of Jewish educational companies providing curriculums and the like within the Jewish day school world. And so I don't have any problem with it, and I endorse it, but I need to see a business plan because we're talking now in theory, you know, so where the revenue is going to come from. And that's why most of the time it defaults to philanthropy or to donations, because it's hard to see where the revenues are going to come from. I mean, investing in a synagogue is not a great way to make money in New York, you know, and hoping to charge dues and have people happy to come because, you know, and make a profit at it. So it's not so easy, but I'm always happy to look at a business plan, but it's got to show that it's realizable and can happen. And by the way, it should be, you know, everybody should have a business plan. I mean, if people want to sell smoothies, you know, they should have a business plan. I mean, I'm sure Anita's, I'm thinking ice cream right now, you know, has to have a business plan. Every place has to have one. And I think that's the thing that also falls down in some Jewish not-for-profits. There isn't a business plan. Forget about where the money's coming from.
You know, the other thing I would like to say, just as we wrap up here, is that, you know, people like yourself, you have so much great business knowledge and wisdom and experience. And like, I just feel that, you know, we don't see a lot of people like you in the Jewish world. I mean, somebody who else comes to mind is Adam Lehman, who came from AOL and some other venture capital and private equity ventures before he became CEO of Hillel International. I just feel like, you know, we have so many assets in the Jewish world, like you and Adam and others, but then we sort of put you into the prism of philanthropy, which it's not that you can't contribute there. It's just that, you know, you've built up this tremendous professional skill set. And I would love to see more of that, you know, come to life in the Jewish world as well. Scott, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you.